I want to begin this lecture on the history of food processing and packaging with a little story. One day, back in the early 1950s on the Japanese island of Koshima, a young female macaque monkey named Imo, which is Japanese for the word potato, began washing sand from a potato before eating it. Meanwhile, the older monkey simply brushed off the sand with her hands. But her brothers and sisters saw this unfamiliar cleansing ritual and soon began plunging their potatoes into the river. The scientists who observed this event studied how the practice spread across the macaque colony, and within a decade, every monkey on the island was washing potatoes even after Imo was long gone. To me, this story illustrates how food processing, and washing is a process, contributes to the experience and value of eating food in a direct and powerful manner, so much so that even monkeys knew when they discovered a good thing. I believe that the benefits of food processing were not lost on our early ancestor, Homo habilis, also known as the handyman. You can see the stone implements that are being used here to smash bone to get at the marrow and to scrape meat from animal pelts. Then about 2 million years ago, another ancestor, Homo erectus, shows up on the scene, and they were fond of using tools, but it wasn't until they were around for 1 million years before they began to use fire. And this was an amazing turn in the evolution of our hominid ancestors as they learned how to cook food. Although this picture here depicts American Indians who are clearly Homo sapiens and not Homo erectus, I thought that it was a good picture of how fire is used to smoke and preserve fish, which is relevant for our early narrative. So the use of fire to process food had some significant benefits and amazing effects. First, fire could reduce the time and energy needed to digest food. Cooked food is not only softer and more palatable, but it quickly releases the energy and nutrients that otherwise would need a long digestive process to obtain. Cooked food also reduces the time and energy needed to find food. Now plants that were too hard or bitter or poisonous could be turned into meals, and large supplies of cooked food could last longer to stretch through the lean times. Some researchers, including the primatologist Richard Wrangham, suggested that cooked food supplied an energy-rich diet that required less energy to chew and to digest, leading to smaller mouths, shorter digestive tract, and larger brains. By the time that Neanderthals and then Homo sapiens appeared on the scene, cooking had been in vogue for hundreds of thousands of years. This picture here depicts the Neolithic cooking utensils and containers that were used 10,000 to 3,000 years ago. They were simple and small-scale utensils made out of wood and stone. By the time of the agricultural revolution, the Egyptians had greatly increased the size and scale of food processing to match their large food production capabilities. The slide here shows a millstone for making flour and an olive press for olive oil. Both of these tools and devices were large and complicated, and they required dedicated craftspeople to build and to operate. The ancient Egyptians cultivated emmer and barley and several other cereal grains, all of which were used to make two main food staples, beer and bread, both of which were created thanks to the discovery of fermentation. In fact, if you're on a paleo diet, you wouldn't eat any foods that require fermentation. These include leavened bread and beer and wine, which all need yeast, and cheese, yogurt, and vegetables that have been pickled, which rely on bacteria and molds. Fermentation can be thought of as a biological food processing technique that greatly increased the variety of foods and also helped to preserve them as well. Speaking of food preservation, here's a great etching from 1720 showing a large structure or stage in Newfoundland where cod fish were brought in abundance, laid out, and then dried and cured before they were put on sailing ships and sent to the market. Food preservation techniques remained largely unchanged for thousands of years until the invention of the Alpert canning jar in 1810. Nicolas Alpert, a French confectioner and brewer, observed that food cooked inside a jar did not spoil unless the seals were broken. At the time, the reason for the lack of spoilage was unknown, and it would be another 50 years before Louis Pasteur demonstrated the role of microbes in food spoilage. So here's a quick shout out to Louis Pasteur. In 1864, he discovered that by heating beer and wine, he could kill the bacteria that caused spoilage and prevented it from turning sour. And by 1880, Pasteur's germ theory was so well recognized that it eclipsed the competing theory of miasma, which held that noxious air caused communicable diseases. But even before germ theory was understood, canning was put to use to feed the enormous armies of the Crimean War, the U.S. Civil War, and the Franco-Prussian War. And canning became even more popular to feed the booming cities of the 19th century. This picture shows the Richardson and Robbins Cannery in Delaware in 1856. By the 1880s, canning had become a large industrial enterprise. Here's a factory in Budapest in 1885, and you can see how the rail lines align alongside of it to distribute the cans that were created there. And of course, the industrial age mechanized the very process of making food. This machine was invented in the 1880s to make biscuits more quickly. It used a variety of dies to stamp out an assortment of different biscuit shapes and sizes. While science and technology was making the food system more efficient, it was also making it more dangerous. In 1882, Friedrich Acrum, a German chemist, wrote a book that revealed the widespread scourge of food adulteration in England. The publication, titled A Treatise on Adulterations of Food and Culinary Poisons, described how chemical additives were being used to make food look and taste better, but at the expense of public health and honesty. For example, red lead gave Gloucester cheese its healthy red hue, flour and arrowroot imbued a richness to cream, and used tea leaves were dried, dyed, and recycled again. And as late as 1877, the local government board found that approximately a quarter of the milk it examined contained excessive water or chalk, and 10% of all the butter, over 8% of all the bread, and 50% of all the gin had copper in them to heighten the color. This cartoon from 1855, published by the satirical magazine Punch, does a good job of explaining the situation. Here's my English accent. "If you please, sir, mother says, will you let her have a quarter pound of your best tea to kill the rats with, and an ounce of chocolate as would get rid of the black beetles?" As the merchant peers over the counter at his little customer, you can see the bags of sand and red lead that are used to augment the food supplies of the store. And the United States wasn't far behind. As it developed rail lines and canning facilities and large food manufacturing plants, the food system became more impersonal, opening the door for unscrupulous and even dangerous business practices. Fortunately, the United States found its product safety champion in a man named Harvey Washington Wiley. He was a chemist who fought for years to institute a federal law to prohibit adulterated and misbranded food and drugs, which President Roosevelt signed in 1906 as the Pure Food and Drug Act. Harvey Wiley would become the first commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. This cartoon shows Uncle Sam peering contentedly at a bottle of Old Doc Wiley's Sure Cure for all adulterations, fake foods, and quack remedies. And in 1956, a commemorative stamp was created for Dr. Wiley. Despite receiving public support and adulation, I've read that Dr. Wiley was hounded out of government, but he was able to spend many years working for the Good Housekeeping Institute, writing articles and keeping the fight for safer foods and products alive. Which brings us to the 20th century, where we see food processing take advantage of continued technological progress. Here's a picture of a chemist for the company International Flavors and Fragrances, which is a large multinational company that has done an amazing job of developing synthetic methods for altering the appearance, taste, and feel of foods. Similarly, the modern food system has seen a revolution in packaging based mainly on developments with plastics. The rest of the lectures will focus more on contemporary food packaging and processing activities, and I've left this slide here to summarize some of the takeaways for food processing history.